I'm going to get this wrong, I'm sure. Jaja wrong? It's close. I am respecting them anyway. They're elders, past and present and the future, and the care that is entrusted to us in this land. And we thank them for all that they have done. It's wonderful to see you all this morning. I hope you slept quickly, because you're going to need to do more of that sleeping quickly later on as we continue on during the week. This morning we begin with our first keynote speaker, and we have Dr. Rachael Kohn. Now I've got this great long list, which I said I didn't want to read because I want you to hear her. But I do want to let you know that Rachael was originally born in Canada, originally from Slovakia, and her mum and dad were from Bohemia. And they did settle in Czechoslovakia. So she's been around a little bit. She's done a lot of study. One particular that I'd like to mention is an MA in Rabbinic Thought and New Testament. She has taught on 3 continents, at universities in 3 continents around the world. She's been part of the ABC, which is the Australian Broadcasting Commission, not the American one, for some 20 years, and I believe her main one, The Spirit of Things, which is a podcast that you can tie into, is about to celebrate its 20th anniversary. Yes. So Rachael has been a commentator on religion and religious affairs for a long time, and we are really, really pleased that we have her with us. Rachael, I leave it to you.
Thank you. It really is wonderful to be here in gorgeous Bendigo. I love well, it's not so small anymore. I love smaller towns. I live in Sydney, so I really appreciate the beauty of a place like Bendigo, particularly its history and its architecture. And I see it so beautiful that Marilyn Monroe decided to drop in and make it. I've written something here that I apologize, it is written. I have to pull together my thoughts because I do focus on many things every week, so I have to make sure I don't get confused. However, I did pull together my thoughts around this theme, which I've called To Differ, To Dig, and To Dialogue. Well, Pretty in Pink wasn't the first thing that came to mind when I saw the bright fuchsia hair pulled up in a ponytail to accentuate the penciled arcs for eyebrows, the pink sequined jacket atop magenta-colored pants, the pink large plastic star earrings, and of course the pink teardrop gem that sparkled in the middle of the forehead like a third eye. Star Lady's appearance spoke of her past as a circus entertainer, but the aim today was not to amuse. Star Lady is a transgender campaigner, and she was speaking in a church, the first such gig she's had. And the message was one of asserting the right to be different and requesting the gathered attendees of the Sacred Edge Festival at Queenscliff Uniting Church in Victoria to accept the gender diversity that exists among a section of the population, her tribe, whom she calls sister girls and brother boys. It's a look that at close range makes me uncomfortable. It's so outre, so affected and stagey. I don't know how it relates to real life in the ordinary world. It was hard to take seriously at first. And then Star Lady, who prefers female pronouns but speaks in an unadulterated male voice, answered my questions in a more thoughtful and informed way than I expected. Despite the look-at-me outfit, she was reflective, and she actually knew something about religious history and the role people like her had in ancient cults. My assumption about her began to shift sideways, if not drop away altogether. I amended my estimation of her seriousness. I felt chastened about my initial reaction and realized that my ordinary world had just grown bigger. Anyway, aren't the class clowns always the ones with the deep pool of suffering and seriousness that is often generously transformed into reaching out to others through humor and feeling? If I felt apprehensive, I'm sure Star Lady did also, since I was carrying the microphone. But I think we both felt relief at our ability to come together in dialogue. Our particular in-group identities, which we each have and cultivate in our daily lives, had just been transcended, and something new was forming in both of us, you could say, an understanding. When I asked Star Lady why she thought a church had asked her to be a keynote speaker, she said, "I think there is an old story that is ending, that is really about division. And I think some churches are moving into a space where they're reflecting on what is love, what is compassion, what is tolerance. And they're making moves to heal that conflict." Can you hear me now? Better? Sorry. Indeed, the gathered attendees, many white-haired parishioners of the church among them, gave the entire panel of LGBTI speakers a standing ovation. It was a moment of surprise and considerable emotion, signaling that ordinary people understood how brave it was for them to speak openly about themselves, about their hurt, about their hopes, and also about their hesitation to accept an invitation to speak in a church. Later, the Reverend Carrie Lingham, who shares the ministry of the church with her husband, the Reverend Charles Gallagher, observed that one of the people on the panel confided to her that this was the first time in decades of publicly speaking that they've had a standing ovation. So, times have changed, and it is often felt at the personal level, as Carrie noted. Now that we're talking about gender diversity, it's safer for people to say, "My grandchildren are LGBTI," or "My children are LGBTI." Hardly anyone is untouched in their families by the pain and oppression of people in that community, she said. And she was speaking from personal experience, as 2 of her 3 sons are gay. What I believe I witnessed at the church that day was that when the most essential values of religion and of our democratic liberal society are called upon to respond to the conflicting identities, lifestyles, and views of contemporary Australian life, we actually have all the resources we need, and they were demonstrated there in the church that day. Our traditions teach us to have respect for one another, to listen, and to treat the stranger with hospitality, dignity, decency, and respect. When these values and their attendant behaviors are taught and regularly modeled, as they are in my synagogue, then I believe we have all the personal and social ingredients of a community that cherishes profound religious values, protects individual freedom, and also respects difference. Pertinent to this has been the public debate about the Safe Schools framework, which is attempted to introduce into our national education system curriculum ways to teach students through role-playing and other activities how to respect others who are different from us. But to my way of thinking, the Safe Schools framework is an example of how secular society over-engineers a response to difference and gets caught up in specific issues, in this case the issue of homosexuality, and makes assumptions about a particular group. If anything, the LGBTI panel showed how diverse that particular group is and how distinctly different each sub-identity is, and their attendant own issues. What I'm saying is that the abiding religious some would say universal human values, pertain to all situations and cover a range of issues and types of people. And there are increasingly many more of these in our society requiring our response. Teaching individuals to respect, to tolerate, to treat people with dignity and compassion and even love of others is a fundamental religious imperative. And it is what gives people a spiritual foundation for their whole lives, regardless of what form of difference they encounter in the future. And that includes gay people who have, I just recently read, a disproportionate incidence of mental health problems ranging from depression to addiction. And I would suggest you look at the book, the recent one by Matthew Todd, Straitjacket, published 2016. More importantly, religion also teaches that attacking others because they're different is reprehensible. It's a sin. Now, that isn't rocket science, it's not social science, it's religion. To differ from the majority can be a creative choice. However, it's not necessarily so, but can simply be an accident of birth, as the intersex person on the panel pointed out. Nor is it always an enjoyable or fulfilling experience to swim against the tide, especially when popular opinion has been arrayed against you. While it took courage for the LGBTI speakers to address a church when they've been condemned by some Christian and other religious leaders, more recently Muslim spokesmen, I would make the observation that today the popular trend, and indeed the popular culture in Australia, is supportive of the LGBTI movement. The zeitgeist is with it. Gay pride parades, which are held annually around the world, have become almost as popular and economically valuable as once was the Santa Claus parade, which I don't even think happens much anymore. And while there would be a significant portion of the population which does not appreciate gay pride parades, violence against them is largely unheard of in Australia and would be swiftly punished, as it was 2 weeks ago in Israel, when the judicial system jailed for life an ultra-Orthodox man who killed one person and stabbed another in a gay pride parade in Israel. The previously marginalized LGBTI people are gaining acceptance, not just acceptance by some, but now reaching a critical mass of support that has made them almost mainstream in many areas of culture and society, especially in the arts, in hospitality, in public service, in government, in law, in finance, and of course, in ministry. Oscar Wilde would have been dumbfounded could he peer into the future from Reading Jail and discover that gay couples are even permitted to adopt and foster children. However, in contrast, Christians who identify with conservative religious beliefs are becoming the opposite. They experience exclusion in all but their own institutions, and in particular are marginalized by the media and in tertiary educational settings where the dominant or default position is avowedly secular and opinion is stacked against them. Indeed, as one of Australia's most thoughtful Christian critics, John Dixon, who has sought to address that Christian vacuum in public life through establishing the Center for Public Christianity, recently discovered even Facebook is a no-go zone. Summarily and without warning, Facebook removed his post when he suggested that advocates of same-sex marriage should share some of the blame for making LGBTI youth feel that they are hated when they deem all opposition to gay marriage in those terms. That's Facebook, an unpredictable and often inconsistent vehicle of opinion. But you would expect more, much Australia's leading educational institution, and sadly you would be disappointed. The University of Sydney Union threatened to deregister the Sydney University Evangelical Union if it did not remove the faith-based requirement for new members to sign a pledge that Jesus is Lord. Members of the historic Christian body were accused of discrimination for not allowing members who would not declare themselves believers in Jesus as Lord. But in March, the Evangelical Union voted 70-1 not to capitulate to the threat of deregistration, even if it meant losing all the facilities it enjoys on par with other clubs and associations on campus. To differ in this context meant that an organization which represents a major faith, and in broader terms, the majority faith in Australia, was being singled out for punitive action because on the university campus, only a minority of students comprised its members. The zeitgeist was certainly not on their side. It was a long haul, and at least 5 years of patient negotiation and discussion passed before May this year, when the University of Sydney Union finally withdrew its threat. Meanwhile, other religious societies came to the support of the Evangelical Union, recognizing that basic religious freedom was at stake. The support of other religious groups is important, if not ironic, because the Evangelical Union's religious exclusivism presumably was what the student union objected to, prompting its call for anti-discrimination legislation to be applied. And yet, the Evangelical Union's right to associate with others of similar beliefs gained further credibility when non-Christian religious groups identified with that sentiment. Conclusion: religious folk, even of different traditions, often recognize and understand each other better than doctrinaire secularists understand them. Indeed, John Dixon's recent article, "The Myth of the Hateful Christian," was retweeted the other day by a Muslim, saying if you replace the term Christian with Muslim, the same thing applies. For Dixon had begun his article saying, "I can't tell you how many times I've been confronted with the sweeping criticism that Christians are all narrow-minded, judgmental, and even hateful." The parallel with Muslims who feel tarred with that sentiment may indeed be accurate, and I would suggest it also applies to other religious groups who beg to differ on popular, moral, or political issues, and I'll come to an example of this later. But Dixon's article was targeted at secularists, who often misconstrue Christian believers as being hostile or nasty just for stating their faith, their different point of view. And I would add that they are regarded as naive sectarians who differ from the utilitarian, rationalist ethos of modern life because, one, they are ignorant, and two, they possess a strange and outdated regard for their religious traditions, which historical and scientific analysis has proven to be false anyway. In other words, believers are beyond the pale. I would venture that this sentiment also drives the New South Wales Youth Parliament Forum that is just now meeting and is pushing for, quote, "the removal of homophobia and sexism on the one hand, and of religious practice from schools and Parliament on the other," as reported in yesterday's Sydney Morning Herald. This unfortunate standoff between secular and religious groups in our society is by no means universal or a foregone conclusion, although the regular missives I received from the Australian Rationalist Society questioning whether taxpayers' money should be wasted on religion programs might suggest this. However, on the contrary, I I would say there was a great deal of mutual respect and curiosity and exchange and flow of ideas between both religious and secular thinkers, many of whom I have interviewed on the spirit of things. And a recent book called Encountering God, edited by the late Nigel Leaves, the Reverend Nigel Leaves, in which I wrote the first chapter, is testament to that fact. It includes articles by Christian clergy who also have graduate degrees in history, microbiology, archaeology, neurology, pediatrics, genetics, and also in the arts, including literature and music. I would also observe that most of the people who I interview on the spirit of things and meet in community situations like this one feel that there's a comfortable relationship between secular society and religious practice. However, there's no doubt that religious and secular groups can and do develop causes and identities that pit them against each other. And this us and them identity formation has been a source of suspicion, leading to sharp words and sometimes hostile actions, even in a democratic and relatively harmonious Australia. In his recent book, Not in God's Name, Confronting Religious Violence, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, the former chief rabbi of the United Kingdom, tackles this feature of group identity by examining its sources. On the one hand, he concedes that groups competing for scarce resources, fostering in-group versus out-group, in-group identity versus an out-group enemy as a means of shoring up their support and to ensure survival. Altruism is practiced within the group while maintaining a war footing with outsiders. It's an explanation that owes as much to the evolutionary study of animals as to the anthropological study of tribes and the sociological study of gangs. But to counter this divisive human tendency, human societies have generated dreams of utopia, be they religious, philosophical, or ideological/political, all of which have imagined a unified humanity. Under one God is how the biblical prophet Zechariah imagined it. In chapter 14:9, on that day there will be one Lord, his name will be worshipped. On that day the Lord's name will be one. Under one idea, such as the Enlightenment's championing of the brotherhood of man bound by reason alone, or under one political system, such as Marxism's classless society. But none of these managed to melt away all the differences between human groups and turn them into one big happy family. Anyway, who ever heard of one big happy family? That didn't have domestic disputes, heartache, difference. It isn't going to happen. And even the hoped-for messianic age is fulfilled only after all the bad guys are removed from the scene. And as most people have noted, one person's heaven is another person's hell. Human diversity is here to stay, and we have to learn to live with it. But providing a scientific explanation of the inevitability of it is not going to tell us or help us to manage it. What Rabbi Sacks provides, however, which is of immense significance for the world's three Abrahamic faiths, and by analogy for other faiths, and I'll mention why later, is that he digs down deep into the biblical narrative, specifically into the stories of sibling rivalry, of which there are a few in the Torah, and finds that the true intention of the text is not, as has been commonly understood, to set up one group against the other and arrange them in a hierarchy of importance, but to show how God's blessing is on each one and is not revoked and is distinct and intact and honored in the text. He doesn't twist or turn the meanings of the Torah scriptures to suit an ideal vision of the world, but in paying close attention to what is written, he sees clearly that we are all God's children, with divine blessings and a place in the Son. It's a very respectful and powerful reading of the biblical stories, whether it's about Abraham and Hagar's son Ishmael versus Abraham and Sarah's son Isaac, or about Jacob versus Esau, or Joseph and his brothers, and even Cain and Abel. These stories unfold before our eyes, evoking sympathy with the ones who suffer, judgment on those who are deceitful, erasing tension between the relationships when reconciliations are effected, and displaying evidence of enduring blessings in the texts themselves. It is a wonder they have been read any other way and have been used to claim superiority of one group over the other. It is a misreading of Scripture. He calls that tendency mimetic desire, a desire not to be just like the other, but to be the other, to eliminate their presence and replace it with your own. It is a kind of holy envy, and it's based on a very narrow idea of God's love. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks says, to be secure in my relationship with God does not depend on negating the possibility that others too have a relationship with him. And he goes on, each has his or her place in the scheme of things. Each has his or her virtues, talents, gifts. Each is precious in the eyes of God. And this sentiment goes right back to 2nd century rabbis who said, quote, the righteous of all nations have a share in the world to come. And Rabbi Akiva of the 1st century who said, beloved is every human person, for he or she is in the image of God. Beloved is Israel, that is, every Jew, for each of us is one of the children of God. Now it becomes clear why these sayings might be of interest to other religions. Why would Rabbi Sacks's close reading of the Bible stories of sibling rivalry be of interest to Buddhists or Hindus or Sikhs who do not read the Bible? They're relevant to them because all these historic religions have experienced the indignity of sectarian division, where one group is deemed inferior to the other, one is set over the other, and where rivalries have turned to exclusion and at times even violence. And yet a closer reading of these traditions with their rich and complex holy texts would offer solutions to this mimetic desire and a way to overcome division, whether it is the highest teachings of liberation through grace in Sikhism, of nirvana through self-denial in Hinduism, or enlightenment through non-dualism in Buddhism. They all presuppose a common humanity that is capable of being more than its base desires and crippling limitations. These teachings disarm hate, have no room for envy, and negate suspicion. And all these traditions teach an overwhelming commitment to compassion, which goes a long way to healing divisions and promoting social harmony, which many believe is what God ultimately wants of us. As the Quran states in Surah 49:13, O mankind, we created you from a single pair, male and female, and made unto you nations and tribes, that you may know each other and not despise each other. Our challenge today in Australia is to continue the work of close reading of our religious texts and traditions of the kind that's been promoted and demonstrated by Rabbi Jonathan Sacks and others, and so to tackle the pressing problems of division and potential violence. Excuse me. that star lady said to me is potentially right when she ventured, I think there is an old story that's ending that is really about division. But it won't happen by itself. We have to make it happen. And anyway, it's forced upon us. We live increasingly in mixed and religiously diverse societies. And we're so lucky to be at the forefront of this experiment in the relatively comfortable and peaceful Australia. And right here in Bendigo, clearly it's going to be a leader in this with its Aspire project. And I await further developments. The message here is that difference is not the same as division. Difference can exist in society and in religion. Division is what happens when those differences are not respected but instead used to set up an artificial barrier between people that makes dialogue and exchange seem impossible. A chasm opens up that looks unbridgeable. The other is considered beyond the pale, a term that originally meant beyond the enclosed border or paling fence which protects home. Can this barrier I'm speaking of be a matter of outward appearance? Yes and no. We felt that sense of an impassable barrier when seeing Muslim women wear the full covering, the black burqa. By erecting a barrier that excludes everyone from seeing her face and us from relating to her as we do to all other sentient beings, that is, with an exchange of a greeting, a smile. The woman in the burqa sets up the ultimate division between herself and others. There's plenty of fierce debate among Muslims about its religious necessity, so I don't need to enter that here. But I may just mention to you that one of Saudi Arabia's leading religious police who worked in Mecca realized that there was scant support in the religious sources for this total covering of the face. And he appeared on television with his wife, with her face exposed, and has written articles about this. He is in great danger and has sustained death threats ever since. But he is a thinking Saudi Arabian who worked for many years as someone who enforced the religious dress code. So it's not just that I'm a white woman, a feminist in the West, concerned about the burqa that hides the face of women. For the most part, however, sartorial differences, especially on campus, quickly become interesting and broadly accepted. The hijab, the headscarf, has become a fashion item, and hardly more unusual than the afro was, worn by African Westerners in the 1960s. It may seem surprising to many people here today, but it was utterly unheard of to actually celebrate frizzy hair. I know, because I straightened mine all those years just to gain acceptance. It was only here in Australia in 1997 that I actually walked out with hair like this, and someone said, "Why did you get a perm?" It took me years to admit that this was not good. Or take the bindi, the red dot on the forehead, worn by Hindu and Jain married women. It's an attractive adornment, even if its spiritual meaning is lost on most non-Indians. The nose stud, also worn by Indian women, has become adopted as fashion jewelry. The various forms of sari are also considered attractive and alluring, if not a bit cumbersome in our fast-paced urban life. The black hat and side curls worn by ultra-Orthodox Jewish men is a curious look, an 18th century holdover from Eastern Europe. Thankfully, it has not caught on. But surprisingly, it did inspire the designer Yves Saint Laurent to feature it on his Paris catwalk a few years ago. Needless to say, that particular fashion didn't catch on. The outward outward signs of difference which mark out a person or group from the mainstream normative culture ironically lose their cultural force as soon as they become a fashion item. But fashion has almost exhausted itself, which is why the body has become the vehicle of difference and even social protest. Body piercing, tattooing, head shaving, neon hair dyes, even being excessively thin if you're a goth, are all the latest ways to be noticed and assert your tribal identity. But what about the groups who do not outwardly differ, who appear just like you and me, and yet are the object of deep-seated prejudice and suspicion? Indeed, their very normality is believed to hide a secret agenda of power and influence, while in reality it conceals the fact that they are just a religious minority trying to fit in. Exclusions on university campuses today are also felt by such a group for whom the zeitgeist is against them. Jewish students everywhere and in Australia are increasingly the butt of hostility, attack, and exclusion if they express or even hint that they have a deep connection to Israel. Imagine if Australian students were everywhere censored for expressing support for their connection to this country despite Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders living here prior to European settlement. It would be an equivalent situation except that Israel was voted into existence by the United Nations in 1948, whereas Australia was just taken in 1788. And the Jewish connection to the land is ancient, documented, and as much part of Jewish religious beliefs as Australia is for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders dreaming. The same cannot be said for England, a country that never had any historic or religious connection to this land. And yet being Jewish on campus today is extremely uncomfortable in certain settings. Israeli academics are singled out for exclusion even when they have worked singularly on Arab-Jewish reconciliation. The boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, the BDS, is noisily promoted by student bodies, such as the Student Representative Council at the University of Sydney. Posters are put up around campus equating Israel's democracy with South Africa's racial apartheid regime. Anti-Semitic graffiti equating Israel with Nazi Germany is commonplace, and Muslim speakers who have a history of vilifying Jews as pigs, subhuman, and deserving of extermination have been invited to speak on campus. Most of the anti-Semitic material today comes from the Arab Muslim world, unfortunately, and promotes conspiracy theories that Jews are in control of the banks, the media, the water systems which they are said to poison, and even the sharks that swim off Sharm el-Sheikh resort in Egypt. I just watched a cartoon series in honor of Ramadan shown by the Fatah TV station that presents Jews as the representatives of several Satans who are scheming against Muhammad. Jews can't be trusted and need to be killed, is the message to children. To hear the extent of this phenomenon, I invite you to download the interview with the Egyptian historian and Coptic Christian Samuel Tadros on the Spirit of Things, October 15, 2015. It is pretty astounding, and even funny if it weren't so serious. Just the other week, the Man Booker Prize winner, film producer, and professor of English literature, Howard Jacobson, addressed this issue in the Catholic Herald, British paper, saying, "To reject Zionism out of hand, to refuse Jews of all peoples the right to self-determination and therefore the right to safety, is to embrace the logic of anti-Semitism." He continued, "The fact that on some university campuses, Zio has become a term of abuse hurled at Jews, performing the very function Yid once did, proves that, incontrovertibly, regardless of what's intended, in effect, anti-Zionism is just the same old anti-Semitism in a differently labeled bottle." End of quote. Jacobson, who taught at the University of Sydney for 3 years, is naming something that most Jewish students and teachers are hesitant to say openly, lest they suffer further exclusion from the very institutions they cherish and value and contribute to. And speaking of contribution, the largest monetary contribution was made just this year to the University of Sydney by an old Jewish couple, Isaac and Susan Wakil, of $10 million for the establishment of a school of nursing. Interesting to read the deeply suspicious coverage of that afterwards. Who were they? Why were they so unknown? Well, in fact, they had been very well known, but then grew very old and stopped being on the A-list of social invitees. They had a lot of money and they decided to disperse it. But so interesting to read. I invite you to read the newspaper coverage at that time, filled with suspicion and innuendo. Well, the reality of this kind of attitude on campus was evidenced by the debacle last year when retired British military officer Colonel Richard Kemp was invited to the University of Sydney to speak on the ethical dilemmas of military tactics and complexities of dealing with non-state armed groups. His talk was relevant to Australia's engagement of non-state armed groups, including ISIS. But within minutes, literally 3 minutes, he was the object of chanting, "Richard Kemp, you can't hide, you support genocide." As Professor Jake Lynch, director of the Center for Peace and Conflict Studies, and others harassed the people present, photographs were being taken of them, and in the case of Professor Lynch, waving money in the face of an elderly woman in the audience in a veiled threat of a court case. Colonel Kemp, who had been talking about his service in Ireland and Afghanistan, was known by the protesters to have been on record elsewhere defending the Israel Defense Forces' attack on Hamas and Gaza. You might be thinking, what's this got to do with chaplaincy? Well, it's the wrong question. How did the physical intimidation of the speaker and the students erect a barrier to dialogue? I'm reminded that another form of intimidation was used here at La Trobe University, perhaps not on this campus, when a Jewish student was too scared to go to class after her name and photograph were posted all around campus, accusing her of voting against an anti-Israel motion in 2014. Jews care about Israel and would not have it disappear, as Hamas states in its charter and in public statements. That would be like asking Aboriginal Australians to forget about country. Jews know that despite the severe challenges that Israel faces in war, it nonetheless achieves a far greater degree of freedom, including religious and sexual freedom for all its citizens, Jews, Christians, Muslims, Druze alike, than any other Middle Eastern state. The chaplaincy issue here is that Jewish students not only feel the injustice of being marginalized and hated, they also feel isolated, since so few, if any, come to their defense. This conference is not only about difference, but also about dialogue, the dialogue we will enjoy in the next few days as a result of digging deep into our spiritual resources. I'm reminded of how I met this trinity of difference, digging, and dialogue with Mariam Issa, a Somali Muslim who described how she came to integrate into Melbourne society despite being, as she put it, a black in Brighton. A tall, strikingly beautiful woman wearing a red turban, a mother of 5 children, by the way. Mariam wears her difference with an easy grace, but it could have been otherwise if her sense of curiosity and love of communicating had not made her innately interested in the world around her. Being Muslim, she could have retreated into herself after September 11th, 2001, when she was still relatively new to this country, and when strangers suddenly looked more uneasy in her presence. But she decided to reflect with the help of Buddhist meditation, which she learned through her interfaith work, about the resources within herself and her tradition that would help improve her experience of the world around her. She came up with the acronym TRUST to describe her spiritual modus operandi. As she described it to me, she said, T is for finding your truth, living your truth, a truth that is yours alone. R is for resilience, the kind that allows you to get up when you're down, to remove the obstacles that can prevent you from living your truth. U is for unity through silence, which you need to connect your thoughts, your emotions, and physical action into that union of self. S is for surrender, surrendering to the life force, the God within us. She says it's so easy to find God, this life force. It is in every breath we take. We have an abundance of it, so surrender to it. T is for timelessness, this moment, this present moment, which is the heavenly time, the eternity in a moment, the eternal now. And of course, when you trust yourself, you trust people around you. And when you do, they trust you, and your world opens up. Your energy is boundless. I have found in my almost 20 years of producing and presenting The Spirit of Things, and several years before that, producing and presenting Religion Today, and before that, the Religion Report, how so many truly thoughtful people from very different religious traditions reveal so clearly how much we have in common, and how we are all working for and aspire to the same thing. If only we accept the task to dig down deep and reveal the teachings that bring us closer together rather than further apart. It's important to remember that God is not who separates us, but we who make the divisions. After all, the differences between people are finite because we are finite, but God is infinite. The Dalai Lama said there's a Tibetan expression which translates roughly as, make sure your brain is not too stuck, too rigid. He says we must stay flexible and improve our minds so that we can improve our world. That sentiment is echoed by Sister Joan Chittister, one of the greatest spiritual voices of our day, a Catholic nun who has now reached the grand age of 80 and is still as insightful and feisty as ever. She said, we have a responsibility to the ongoing creation of life, and we share that with our humble God, who is accompanying us right now, right here, with you and me, not monitoring us, not abandoning us, not setting out to catch us, but saying to us, I'm with you. You did great yesterday. We can match it today. This God is a summoning God, saying, don't stop now. Come on. Don't stop growing now. Don't close your mind now. Don't stop your soul now. I've got so much more that you can find if you just look. I know that Rabbi Jonathan Sachs would agree completely with that sentiment. But finally, let me end with another American Catholic who has a couple of years on Sister Joan. He's 82. And I'm speaking of the philosopher Michael Novak, whom Rabbi Jonathan Sachs quotes. In a genuine pluralistic society, there is no one sacred canopy. By intention, there is not. At its spiritual core, there is an empty shrine. That shrine is left empty in the knowledge that no one word or image or symbol is worthy of what we all seek there. Its emptiness, therefore, represents the transcendence which is approached by free consciences from a virtually infinite number of directions. Well, I'm sure that over the next few days we will travel down some of these roads toward the center, and let us hope we find there a dream of inspiring proportion. For Martin Luther King Jr. galvanized a nation and a generation with a dream, not a nightmare. It's up to us in the religious sphere to cultivate the dream so that the nightmares that threaten to terrorize and engulf us do not have a hope of succeeding.